An aerial photo of the area between Niobrara and Gavins Point Dam, clear over on the right, in 1941. In 1941, the Missouri River was a huge, large river system like it still is today, but it was doing what large rivers are supposed to do. They were carrying a lot of water downstream, and with that, they were carrying a lot of sediment downstream with unimpeded flows. Here, I think this is a really good example of how this large river was meandering from valley wall to valley wall with meanders on the scale of miles. And it gives you a good feel for how large this river is. So Gavins Point Dam, though, was closed off in 1955, and so the reservoir began to fill. And so this is what it looks like in 1964 when it's still a fairly young reservoir. Not really any sedimentation problems that are showing up, at least not on the surface here. So you see this reservoir that's built all the way up to about 2 miles upstream of Springfield, and it's pretty much clean, clear water. This little bit of sediment you see here is just a remnant of the floodplain that was there that was not submerged. Then came the sedimentation problems over the next few decades. And so if I take a recent photo and put this on here, you can see now how the sedimentation is built in and is encroaching miles and miles into Lewis and Clark Lake. Looking at it from a little bit different viewpoint, so this is actual satellite imagery from the Aros Data Center. And what I've done is I've pulled together some satellite imagery on a frequency of about every 2 years, starting in 1994. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of the dynamics of the delta as we go from 1994 to today through this imagery. So here's the Niobrara River entering the Missouri. And then here is the leading edge of the delta, and Springfield would be right here. So this is what it looked like in 1994. 2 years later, in 1996, not that much different. Again, you know, the fairly well-defined channel that's down in this reach, and then entering the sort of what we call this labyrinth of network of smaller channels in the head area of the delta. But in those 2 years, it really had not advanced a lot into Lewis and Clark Lake. But going from 1996 to 1998, we saw a pretty good advancement. And so it basically went from here clear up into here where you see all of this bare sand. And for those of you that have lived around here, you know, remember that 1997 was a very high flow year in the Missouri River. They were discharging 70,000 cubic feet per second out of Gavins Point Dam for essentially the entire summer, whereas a normal average summertime flow is half that, about 35,000 cubic feet per second. And as I'll talk about later, what we see is that when we have those high flow years going through the lake, that's when this delta really tends to move forward significantly into the lake. In the year 2000, again, the delta really didn't move that much further ahead. 2003, you know, it isn't really changing that much. Again, in 2006, about the same. And in 2008. Now you can see where the Corps had built these two sandbars. I think they built those in 2007 or else early 2008, and they're showing up right here. That's not delta sediment, but sandbars built by the Corps of Engineers. But then we get to 2010, and the next slide then is 2012. And so obviously things changed a lot between 2010 and 2012 because of the 2011 flood. So again, we have all this new sediment that's pushed up into Lewis and Clark Lake. And you can see all the bare sand there that is that new sediment. Also, you can tell that we were in a drought in the summer of 2012 by how brown everything is. And you also see all this white. That's all of either the new sand deposits or the previously vegetated sandbars that have been wiped clean by the floodwaters of 2011. So that it basically shows you how much the flood of 2011 changed the scape of the river between Niobrara and the leading edge of the delta that year. Now if we go ahead to 2014, the last slide, you see again, basically the delta hasn't changed much up here in terms of where it's gone. And a lot of those sandbars down in here have become vegetated, as well as a lot of the bare sand up in here has become vegetated in the 2.5 to 3 years since the flood had happened. So this is pretty much what we have today then, where we have, basically a channel that's coming through the Niobrara area, sometimes splits a little bit, but pretty much stays as a river channel until we get several miles upstream from Springfield, where then it starts to diverge into just a whole bunch of smaller channels that make its way through the delta. So let's zoom in a little bit to the Niobrara area and look at how this area has evolved since the dam was built. This is an air photo taken in 1941. Remember, the dam was closed off in 1955, so this was pre-dam, no impact at all by dam construction. So here you can see this sort of this channel coming around, looks like probably some type of island right here, right at the confluence of the Niobrara River. And it's pretty much an open river channel carrying a lot of sediment as it moves its way downstream toward its confluence with the Mississippi River. Go ahead to 1956. Now this is 1 year after the dam was closed off. And again, we have a pretty open river channel in here, a few sandbars, a few little islands, no sedimentation problem. And the reservoir is just starting to reach Springfield and fill in here 1 year after the dams were closed off. 1960, again, at least at the surface, there's no real sedimentation problem in this area. You can see, again, this basically a pretty good vegetated sandbar, probably even more of an island here. It looks like it's got some pretty good-sized trees on it that you can see by these dark gray dots. But there's no delta that's building up in this area yet, and pretty much open lake at Springfield. 1964, still really not a problem. So this is 9 years after the dam was closed off, and we're really not seeing, at least at the surface, any huge sedimentation problem. But as I'll show in a few slides later here, there were problems that were starting, but they were just under the surface. Now we jump forward to 1978, and all of a sudden, this is where the delta sediments start to pop out above the surface of the water. So you can see, starting about right in here, all the way up past Springfield, we've got pretty good delta sediments sticking out above the river. Santee is right up in here, so the sediments were past Santee as well at that point. For those of you that were around here in the 1970s, you may remember sort of when that happened, a transition from the 1960s to the 1970s when we started getting these delta sediments showing up above the water. 1984, again, the delta's just taking hold a little bit better. What we're seeing down in here is probably more sediment starting to show up, right around the Niobrara area itself, at least in terms of sandbars and so on from Niobrara all the way into the main delta. There's quite a bit of it showing up in here by 1984. And then a current photo from today where you can see the status of those delta deposits building their way from the Niobrara on down. So where does the sediment come from? There's been a lot of studies and reports on this, and they basically all agree, as anyone intuitively knows, that the Niobrara River provides the majority of the sediment. So most of them say around 50 to 55% of the sediment entering the delta is coming from the Niobrara River. Some of them go as high as saying 60%. Ponca Creek is tagged at 10%, as is Bazile Creek. And then the Missouri River upstream is a contributor. Choteau Creek and Emmanuel Creek don't really flow that much, and so they're really not a real significant contributor of sediment. And then you even have some bank erosion going on Lewis and Clark Lake that contributes to it. So if you take this is a current photo of it's 2 years old, air photo of the confluence of the Niobrara River right here, coming into the Missouri River right here. And you can really get a feel for the sediment that's coming down the Niobrara River here. And you can see that sediment plume entering the Missouri River, wrapping around this bar here, and even heading down here on this part of the channel. So you can get you can just tell, basically by looking at that photo that obviously the Niobrara River is dumping a lot of sediment. But you can also tell in looking at this that the Niobrara River, a lot of sediment also gets trapped in the last couple miles of the Niobrara River. And there are reports that show that a phenomenon that we call avulsion has occurred several times in the past on the Niobrara River, and that basically means that the channel suddenly jumps and goes somewhere else. And so, like just upstream from here, that had happened in the not too distant past, where the channel was heading more off to the east and suddenly jumped over to the west and became the predominant channel there. That's a good sign or a good indication of a river that's has a lot of sediment dropping out in its riverbed and building up its riverbed. And so it's not just happening here in the Delta and up by Springfield. It's actually happening here in the last couple miles of the Niobrara River pretty significantly as well. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the field work we did. One of the components of our field work was to look at just what's out there on the Delta. And for this particular study that we did, we looked mainly at what's in sort of the last few miles of the Delta itself. We didn't have time to go all the way up to the confluence of the Niobrara. So we started at the leading edge at Lewis and Clark Lake and worked our way back to about Springfield, or a little bit upstream of Springfield. In that area of the Delta, what we found is that there's a heck of a lot of Phragmites, also known as common reedgrass. And it's the predominant type of vegetation. It's very thick, it's very tall. Here you can see one of our grad students walking through there, and he's about a little over 6 feet tall. So you can see how tall those Phragmites get. One of the interesting things that we did find is that there's actually two types of Phragmites out there. One is a native type of Phragmites, but another one is an invasive type of weed. And so you've probably heard of some of the invasive type of plants out there, like purple loosestrife and salt cedar and those. And those are bad because of they're invasive and because of their nature of wanting to take over. This invasive type of Phragmites that we find out there a lot is also a bad plant in that way, in that it has a way of establishing itself on a sandbar and pretty much taking over that sandbar in terms of the vegetation that's out there. It also reproduces quite rapidly. So one of the things we found, and this is a picture from the summer of 2012. So there was, quite a few areas where even in the lower part of the Delta, the floodwaters had stripped the vegetation off of the sandbars and left bare sand. The floodwaters also deposited a lot of new sands down there during the flood of 2011. But what we found in walking around in these bare sands is that a lot of times there were older Phragmites stands that had survived the flood and newer ones that were already popping out just several months into the first growing season after the flood. And in those ones where they were sort of reestablishing themselves, you see these vines, and you can even find them out there today whenever these things are moving on to new ground. These are called stolons, and they're basically above ground roots of the Phragmites. Now, I don't know if you can see it on these slides, but about every 18 inches, a new plant pops up out of these stolons. So every 18 inches, there's a new plant popping up. And these things literally can extend up to 70 feet away from the main group of plants. So it's a way for these invasive Phragmites to really reach out and advance their hold on a sandbar really fast. And that's exactly what they were doing. As a matter of fact, we were first out there, I think, in July of 2012. And then we went back again to some of the same sites in October of 2012, just 3 months later. And what we found is a lot of these sites we had been to that had bare sand, we couldn't even get to anymore because the Phragmites were so thick in those sites. So there are some areas, though, where it's not Phragmites. So, back in the Delta, you have a lot of these backwaters and sort of ponded areas. And a lot of times in there was cattail marsh. But always when there was always that looming stand of Phragmites sitting right behind it as if it was ready to take over. We also have the cottonwood trees and the willow trees that are so predominant on the banks of the Missouri rivers, upstream and downstream from the delta. But they never get very big. So this is kind of the extent of how big they would get. And they're really limited by the fact that the water table is so shallow on the bars that they're growing on that they'll probably never really get very tall. These two pictures were not pictures from the delta, fortunately, but I just wanted to show you some of the invasives that we did find. So there is purple loosestrife out there, and there is salt cedar out there. And so these are really nasty invasives if they get out of control, because the purple loosestrife, for example, grows so thick that it will pretty much choke out any other type of vegetation. And it has the ability to reproduce very fast. Salt cedar does the same thing. It basically drops salt onto the soil around it and makes the soil very alkaline or brine so that no other plants can grow. So it sort of is selfish in that way, in that it just ruins the soil for other plants. And so it takes over areas that way as well. So just some facts about the ecology of the delta that we came away from this. Phragmites is the dominant vegetation that's out there. It spreads very aggressively, and it can quickly colonize bare sand patches, and it crowds out the good native wetland plants that you would rather see out there. And anytime you take away from the diversity of plants in any community, you're doing harm to the ecosystem. And that's exactly what these Phragmites do, is they're taking away from the diversity of plants that would normally grow in a wetland system like this. There are several patches of cottonwood and willow trees, but they were present on sandbars that were built really high above the water table and won't really have an opportunity to grow. Also, a recent animal survey of the delta found that a diversity of species similar to what would be expected in other parts of the river, 79 species of birds, 5 species of frogs, some turtles, and some mussel. So in other words, in terms of those particular species that were looked at, what they found is that the delta wasn't really anything special for those species, because it was basically just like a regular riverine habitat, and that you would find them in other parts of the river as well. Now, the thing that they didn't look at are fishes. And I know, just from talking to fishermen out there and seeing what goes on, the delta does have sort of a unique quality in terms of its fishery.